The Arizona territory stretched before him like a broken promise. All cracked earth and dancing heat waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like ghosts. In the summer of 1872, the desert showed no mercy to any living thing, white man or Apache, saint or sinner. The sun hammered down from a bleached sky, turning the red rocks into furnaces and the sand into burning coals that could blister a man's feet through worn boot leather. Samuel Crowhorse sat in the meager shade of an outcropping, his massive frame still as the stones around him, at 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer without strain. He cut an imposing figure against the harsh landscape. The scar that ran from his left collarbone to just above his heart caught the light when he moved, a pale slash against his sun-darkened skin. His Apache blood showed in the sharp planes of his face, the deep-set eyes that missed nothing, and the way he could sit for hours without fidgeting, as if he'd become part of the mountain itself. 3 years had passed since the cavalry had come to his village. 3 years since he'd returned from hunting to find his wife, Mourning Dove, and their son lying still in the dust, their blood mixing with the red earth. The soldiers had claimed they were looking for raiders, but Mourning Dove had only been gathering herbs for the elder who suffered from joint pain. His boy, barely walking, had been playing with colored stones nearby. Samuel had buried them with his own hands, then walked away from what remained of his people. Some had gone to the reservation, others had scattered like seeds in the wind. He'd chosen neither path, making his camp in the shelter of the Superstition Mountains, where the rocks remembered older times and the wind sang songs that white men couldn't understand. His days followed a simple pattern now. Hunt when the game moved, collect water from the hidden spring, mend what needed mending, sleep when darkness came. He'd built a life stripped down to its bones, with no room for memory or hope. Just the basic business of staying alive in a land that wanted to kill everything foolish enough to draw breath. 2 days' ride to the east, in the settlement of Perdition, a very different scene was unfolding. The town, with its single dusty main street and collection of sun-baked buildings, prided itself on being civilized. It had a church with a real bell, shipped all the way from Philadelphia. It had a schoolhouse where children learned their letters. It had laws and proper Christian folk who knew right from wrong. Margaret Holsworth stood in the center of that civilization, surrounded by faces twisted with righteous anger. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now hung loose around her shoulders. Her dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, bore fresh tears where grasping hands had pulled at it. Blood trickled from a split in her lower lip, and her left eye was already beginning to swell shut. Shameless woman! Her mother-in-law, Constance Holsworth, spat the words like bitter medicine. The older woman's face, weathered by years of desert sun and disappointment, contorted with disgust. Living in my house, eating my food, all while carrying on with God knows who. I never, Margaret began, but a hand struck her across the face, sending her stumbling. Don't you dare lie! Constance's voice rose to a shriek. 3 years married to my James, God rest his soul, and not one baby to show for it. Now he's cold in the ground not 4 months. And suddenly you're looking healthier than ever. You think we're fools? The crowd murmured agreement. These were people who'd known Margaret since she'd arrived as James Holsworth's bride, barely 18 and fresh from St. Louis with romantic notions about frontier life. They'd watched her struggle to please a man who preferred whiskey to conversation, who'd grown meaner with each passing year of their childless marriage. When fever had finally taken James, they'd offered proper condolences while privately thinking she was well rid of him. But a widow was supposed to mourn. A widow was supposed to waste away with grief. Margaret had done neither, and in a town where gossip was currency, her failure to properly suffer had evolved into darker suspicions. Please, Margaret said, raising her hands to ward off another blow. I've done nothing wrong. James died of fever. You all know that. The doctor's a drunk, someone in the crowd called out. Could have been poison for all he knew. She was seen talking to that traveling merchant last month, another voice added, smiling at him, bold as brass. That's enough evidence for me, Constance declared. She turned to the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd helped found this town. I won't have this harlot under my roof another night. She's got nothing but what she came with. Nothing. The rest belongs to the Holsworth family. Rough hands pushed Margaret forward, through the crowd that parted like the Red Sea. If the Red Sea had been made of condemning stares and muttered curses, they marched her to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the endless expanse of desert. Please, Margaret tried once more. At least let me take some water, some food. Constance appeared beside her, holding Margaret's old carpet bag, the one she'd carried from St. Louis. She upended it, and a few threadbare garments fell into the dust. There, that's yours. The rest stays here, and if you're smart, you won't come back. This is a God-fearing town. We don't tolerate your kind. Someone threw a stone. It struck Margaret's shoulder, and she stumbled forward into the desert. Another stone followed, then another. She ran, her worn shoes slipping in the sand, the jeers of the townspeople following her until distance and the rising wind swallowed them. The desert received her without judgment. It didn't care about her supposed sins or her empty womb or the way she'd smiled at a merchant who'd shown her simple kindness. It only cared that she was soft-bodied and weak, carrying no water in a land where water meant life. Margaret walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging the impossibility of her situation. The sun climbed higher, turning her dark hair into a furnace that trapped heat against her skull. Her dress, already torn, caught on thorny ocotillo and jumping cholla that left their barbed gifts in her skin. Her shoes, city shoes never meant for this terrain, began to separate at the seams. By midday, her throat felt like she'd swallowed sand. The horizon wavered and danced, showing her visions of lakes that vanished when she stumbled toward them. She'd heard stories of travelers going mad in the desert, chasing mirages until they collapsed. She'd thought them weak. Now she understood. The wind began to pick up as afternoon wore on, carrying with it the sharp sting of sand. Margaret squinted against it, trying to make out any landmark, any sign of shelter or water, but the desert had become a kaleidoscope of red and brown, spinning around her in dizzying circles. Then the sandstorm hit in earnest. It came like a wall of static, a brown curtain that dropped over the world and turned day into twilight. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, angry and hungry. Sand filled Margaret's nose, her mouth, her eyes. She pulled her torn dress up over her face, but the sand found its way through every gap, scouring her skin raw. She stumbled, fell, crawled forward on hands and knees that left bloody prints in the sand. Direction became meaningless. Time became meaningless. There was only the storm and the terrible certainty that she would die here, that her bones would join the countless others the desert had claimed. When her strength finally gave out, Margaret collapsed beside a large rock that offered an illusion of shelter. She curled into herself, making her body as small as possible, and waited for the end. Her last coherent thought was a bitter one, that Constance would probably be pleased, a proper punishment for an improper woman. Miles away, in his camp beneath the overhang, Samuel Crowhorse watched the storm approach with the calm of a man who'd seen many such tempests. He'd already secured his few possessions, checked that his water vessels were covered, brought his horse to the most protected area of his shelter, but something made him uneasy. The storm felt different, carried a weight that had nothing to do with sand and wind. His grandmother would have called it a spirit wind, the kind that brought change whether a man wanted it or not. When the worst of it had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and oddly quiet, Samuel emerged to check for damage. His camp had weathered it well, but the landscape had changed, as it always did after such storms. New dunes had formed while others had vanished. Familiar landmarks had shifted position. He was securing a loose rope when his horse whinnied and pawed the ground, ears pricked toward the east. Samuel followed the animal's gaze and saw something that didn't belong, a splash of blue against the red rocks, maybe half a mile distant. He almost turned away. The desert was full of things that didn't belong. remnants of those who'd underestimated its power. But his horse whinnied again, and something in the sound made him grab his water skin and head toward the anomaly. As he drew closer, the blue resolved into fabric, closer still, and he could make out the shape of a body, curled small against a boulder. A woman, by the look of it. Though covered in so much sand, she might have been carved from the desert itself. Samuel approached cautiously. He'd heard stories of bandits using injured women as bait for travelers. But as he knelt beside her, he could see this was no deception. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her exposed skin raw from the sand's abrading. When he touched her shoulder, she didn't respond. Still breathing, though barely, he dribbled water between her lips, watched her throat work reflexively to swallow. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open, making a decision that would have puzzled him if he'd stopped to think about it. Samuel wrapped his blanket around her and lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird built of hollow bones and feathers. He carried her back to his camp, her head lolling against his chest, and laid her in the coolest part of his shelter. With patient hands, he cleaned the sand from her face, treated the worst of her scratches with a salve made from desert plants his mother had taught him to prepare. When twilight came, painting the rocks purple and gold, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened, green as cottonwood leaves. He noted with surprise and fixed on his face. He watched awareness return, followed immediately by terror. She scrambled backward, or tried to. Her body betrayed her, too weak for flight. A sound escaped her throat, half sob, half scream, raw from the sand she'd swallowed. Samuel remained still, understanding her fear. He was Apache in a world that had taught her to fear Apaches. He was a man alone with her in the wilderness. He was everything the stories had warned her about. But instead of reaching for her, he reached for the water skin, held it out, then set it on the ground between them when she flinched. He spoke then, his voice rusty from disuse but careful to use the English he'd learned in better days. "I need a woman," he said simply, "and you need shelter." Margaret stared at the giant before her, her mind struggling to process his words through the fog of exhaustion and fear. "I need a woman, and you need shelter." The statement hung between them like a challenge, or perhaps a bargain written in the desert dust. She pressed herself harder against the rock wall. Ignoring the sharp edges that dug into her spine, this man, this Apache, towered over her even while sitting, his presence filling the small shelter like smoke. The scar across his chest caught the dying light. A testament to violence survived. Everything about him screamed danger. From his size to his race, to the fact that they were alone in the wilderness, with no witness but the stars. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely recognizable as her own. "I have nothing, no money, nothing worth taking." Samuel studied her with dark eyes that revealed nothing. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, simply sat with the patience of stone while she trembled before him. After a long moment, he pushed the water skin closer with one finger. "Drink," he said. "Then we talk." Margaret's thirst won over fear. She grabbed the water skin with shaking hands and drank deeply, the cool liquid both blessing and torment to her raw throat. When she finally lowered it, she found him preparing food, dried meat and some kind of flat bread she didn't recognize. "I don't understand," she said, clutching the empty water skin like a shield. "What do you want from me?" Samuel continued working, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the simple meal preparation. "My wife is 3 winters dead. My cookpot sits empty. My clothes grow holes with no one to mend them. A man alone in the desert turns into a ghost." He set the food on a flat stone between them. "You were cast out. I saw the bruises, the torn dress. Town people don't throw away things they value." The casual accuracy of his assessment stung. Margaret touched her swollen eye unconsciously, then dropped her hand. They accused me of things, untrue things. Town people often do." His voice carried no judgment, just statement of fact. "Eat." She wanted to refuse, to maintain some dignity, but her stomach cramped painfully at the sight of food. She reached for a piece of the dried meat, noticed how he pulled back slightly to give her space. The meat was tough, gamey, but she'd never tasted anything so wonderful. As she ate, she studied him covertly. Despite his intimidating size, he moved with careful deliberation, each gesture controlled. His face, weathered by sun and wind, might have been carved from the red rock surrounding them. She guessed him to be perhaps 40 winters, though it was hard to tell. Apache aged differently than white men, or so she'd heard. "You speak English well," she ventured. "Mission school, long ago, before—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Before many things." They sat in silence while purple shadows claimed the desert. Samuel built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the shelter walls. Margaret found herself mesmerized by the simple domesticity of it. A man tending a fire while night fell. It could have been any home, anywhere, if not for everything else. "What did you mean?" she finally asked. "About needing a woman?" Samuel fed another stick to the fire. "I meant what I said. I need a woman's hands for woman's work, cooking, mending, making this—" He gestured around the sparse camp. "Less like a grave, and in return, shelter, food, protection." He met her eyes across the fire. "No harm from me. This I promise on my son's memory." The mention of a son surprised her. She'd assumed him childless, alone by choice rather than tragedy. "Your son?" Pain flickered across his features, quickly suppressed. "Killed with his mother. Soldiers came while I was hunting." He touched the scar on his chest. "I arrived too late to save them. Almost too late to die with them." Margaret absorbed this information, reassessing the man before her. Not a savage who'd kidnapped her for dark purposes, but a grieving widower living in exile. The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on her. Both cast out, both alone, both carrying wounds that showed and wounds that didn't. "I'm not sure I'd be much use," she said carefully. "I was raised in St. Louis. I can cook some, sew some, but frontier skills—" She gestured helplessly. "You survived the desert storm. You're stronger than you know." He rose, moving to the back of the shelter where supplies were stacked. "Sleep now. Tomorrow we see." He laid out a buffalo robe near the fire, then moved to the far side of the shelter with his own blanket. The distance he put between them, the way he turned his back to give her privacy, eased something in Margaret's chest. Whatever else this man might be, he wasn't what she'd feared in those first terrified moments. She curled up on the buffalo robe, luxuriating in its warmth after the cold sand. Her body ached in 100 places. Her skin felt scoured raw, but she was alive. Alive when she'd been certain she would die. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "My name is Margaret," she said into the darkness. "Margaret Holsworth, widow. Samuel Crowhorse," came the reply. Also widowed. She slept then, deeply and dreamlessly, for the first time in months. The days that followed established a rhythm of careful coexistence. Margaret woke each dawn to find Samuel already gone, the fire banked but warm, water and food left within easy reach. He returned by midday with game, rabbits, sometimes a deer haunch, once a wild turkey that she hadn't even known lived in the desert. At first, she simply watched him work, watched how he cleaned his kills efficiently, wasting nothing, how he scraped and treated the hides, how he repaired his tools with patient skill. Her city-bred sensibilities initially recoiled from the blood and butchering, but necessity had a way of adjusting one's delicate nature. "Show me," she said on the 4th day, as he began skinning a rabbit. Samuel paused, then handed her a smaller knife. "Cut here, along the belly. Shallow. Don't puncture the organs." Her first attempts were clumsy, but he corrected her with patience, guiding her hands when needed. She noticed he was careful about touching her, always announcing it first, always pulling back as soon as the lesson was complete. By the end of the first week, she could clean a rabbit without his help. Small victory, but victory nonetheless. The shelter, she discovered, was more complex than it first appeared. Samuel had chosen the site well. with a natural windbreaks and access to a hidden spring. He'd improved it over 3 years, adding stone walls where nature left gaps, creating separate areas for supplies, cooking, sleeping. It was the dwelling of a man who'd stripped life down to essentials. But those essentials were carefully maintained. She began adding her own touches, organized his supplies more efficiently, swept the sandy floor with a broom made from desert grass, found ways to make the simple meals more varied with the plants he'd stored. He said nothing about these changes, but she caught him pausing sometimes, looking at some small improvement with an expression she couldn't quite read. The silence between them gradually became less strained. Margaret had never been a chatterer, and her marriage to James had taught her the value of quiet. Samuel seemed to appreciate this. They could work side by side for hours without speaking, communicating in gestures and glances. But sometimes, especially in the evening when the day's work was done and the fire held back the darkness, they talked. "Your husband," Samuel said one night. "He was not kind." Margaret stared into the flames, considering how to answer. "He wasn't cruel, exactly, just disappointed. He'd wanted a wife who could give him sons, and She shrugged. "After 3 years, he mostly ignored me, spent his time in the saloon. The drink made him mean sometimes, but usually he just pretended I wasn't there. A man who ignores his wife is a fool." The simple statement made her throat tight. She changed the subject. "Tell me about your wife, Mourning Dove." His face softened at the name. She laughed like water over stones. "Always singing, even when times were hard. She could make beauty from nothing, beaded work so fine it looked like captured sunlight. Our son had her eyes, her quick smile." "How old was he?" 2 winters, just learning to run without falling." Samuel's voice roughened. "He called me Appa, father, his first word." They sat in companionable grief. 2 people who understood that some wounds never fully healed. The fire burned lower, and Margaret found herself stealing glances at the man across from her, in the gentler light. She could see past his intimidating size to the person beneath, the way he absently rubbed his scarred chest when he thought of his family, the careful way he tended the fire, as if it too required gentleness. "I'll teach you more tomorrow," he said suddenly. "Plants for medicine, reading weather signs, desert survival. You should know these things." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "If I'm staying here, nothing is certain," he interrupted. "You should be able to survive alone if needed." The implications chilled her. Was he planning to send her away? Or was he simply being practical, preparing her for a time when accident or violence might leave her alone again? She chose to focus on the present. Each dawn brought new lessons. Samuel showed her which cacti held water, which plants could heal and which would kill. He taught her to read tracks in the sand, to find direction by the stars, to sense weather changes in the wind's behavior. "Here," he said one afternoon, pointing to marks in the dust. "What do you see?" Margaret knelt, studying the impressions. "Rabbit? No, wait, the back feet are longer. Jackrabbit. Good. How long ago?" She examined the edges of the tracks, remembering his lessons about how wind and time degraded signs. "This morning, before the wind picked up." "You learned quickly." The approval in his voice warmed her more than it should have. As the days passed, she noticed other things. How he sang sometimes in Apache, soft melodies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. How he could remain perfectly still for hours while hunting, becoming part of the landscape. How his rare smiles transformed his stern features, making him look younger, almost boyish. She noticed too how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with the hungry gaze she'd endured from men in town, but with something more complex, curiosity, perhaps, or loneliness recognizing itself in another. One evening, a desert rain swept through, filling the air with the scent of wet sage and creosote. They sat in the shelter, watching the water run in temporary rivers down the rocks. Margaret had been mending one of his shirts, squinting in the firelight to make small, neat stitches. "You don't have to work in the dark," Samuel said. He rose and returned with something wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a pair of spectacles, the glass cracked but usable. "These were mourning doves," he said quietly. "For close work. Her eyes—" He paused. "You have the same difficulty. I've watched you squint." Margaret held the spectacles carefully, understanding the magnitude of the gift. To offer her his dead wife's possessions was to acknowledge her presence as more than temporary, more than mere convenience. "I can't," she began, but he was already turning away. "They do no good sitting in leather," he said gruffly. "Use them." She put them on, marveling at how the stitches suddenly came into sharp focus. When she looked up to thank him, she found him watching her with an expression so raw it took her breath, loss and longing and something else, something neither of them was ready to name. The moment passed. He fed the fire. She returned to her mending, but something had shifted between them, subtle as the wind changing direction. That night, she heard him stirring restlessly in his blankets. The soft Apache words he murmured in his sleep needed no translation. The universal language of grief, speaking to loved ones who could no longer answer. She lay still, pretending to sleep, giving him the privacy of his sorrow. But when his breathing finally steadied, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for saving me." She didn't expect an answer and didn't receive one, but in the morning, she found he'd left her something beside the usual water and food. A small leather pouch containing several precious sewing needles and strong thread made from sinew. Tools for staying. Tools for building something more than mere survival. The desert bloomed after the rain, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost gentle. Tiny flowers appeared overnight. Desert marigolds, brittle bush, fairy dusters, painting splashes of yellow and pink against the red earth. Margaret marveled at the transformation, understanding for the first time how beauty could thrive in the harshest places. She'd been with Samuel for nearly a month now, and their life had settled into rhythms that felt both foreign and natural. She woke each day with purpose, her hands busy with the work of survival that had become the work of living. The blisters from those first weeks had hardened into calluses. Her city-pale skin had browned under the desert sun. The woman who'd fled perdition in torn shoes and terror was disappearing, replaced by someone she didn't quite recognize yet. "Today we gather," Samuel announced one morning, handing her a woven basket. "The rain brings medicine plants. They won't last long in this heat." They set out together, leading his horse, a sturdy paint mare he'd introduced simply as Horse, though Margaret had heard him whisper another name to her in Apache when he thought no one was listening. The morning was cool, the sky a blue so pure it hurt to look at. Samuel showed her which plants to harvest, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he demonstrated the proper way to take only what was needed, leaving enough for regeneration. "The desert gives," he said, "but only to those who respect it." Like this, Margaret carefully uprooted a small plant with silvery leaves, copying his technique. "Better. You have gentle hands." He moved on quickly, but she caught the approval in his voice. They worked in companionable silence, filling their baskets with the nature's pharmacy. Samuel knew uses for everything, this one for fever, that one for wounds, another for women's troubles that made Margaret blush when he explained it matter-of-factly. "How do you know so much?" she asked, adding another plant to her collection. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She tried to teach me, but I was young, more interested in hunting and proving myself a warrior." His voice carried old regret. "I learned too late that her knowledge was the greater power." Around midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a large boulder. Samuel produced food from his pack, dried meat, flatbread, and precious wild berries he'd found that morning. They ate quietly, watching a hawk circle overhead. "You're different," he said suddenly. Margaret looked at him questioningly. "When you came, you were—" He gestured vaguely. "Broken, like a bird with clipped wings. Now you begin to remember how to fly." The observation was so unexpected, so gently delivered, that the tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them away, embarrassed. "I was never much of a bird, more like a mouse, hiding in corners. Mice are survivors. Samuel countered. Smart, quick. They know when to run and when to be still. They returned to camp as afternoon heat began to build. Margaret set about processing the plants they'd gathered, carefully following Samuel's instructions for drying and storing each one. He watched her work, occasionally correcting her technique, but mostly just observing. That evening, as she prepared their meal, she'd taken over the cooking entirely now. She felt his eyes on her again. It was becoming familiar, this weight of his attention. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with something that made her hyper-aware of her movements. The food is better now, he said, as they ate her stew of rabbit and wild onions. It's the same ingredients you always had. No, it tastes of care now, of home. The word hung between them. Home. Such a simple concept that had become so complicated for both of them. After dinner, Samuel did something unprecedented. He brought out a wooden flute, carved with designs she couldn't make out in the firelight. I haven't played in 3 years, he said, almost apologetically. Why now? He looked at her across the fire, and something in his expression made her heart skip. The silence feels less heavy now. The music he drew from the flute was unlike anything Margaret had heard. It wasn't the jaunty tunes of saloon players or the hymns of church. This was older, deeper. Notes that seemed to rise from the earth itself and speak of wind and stone and endless sky. She closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, feeling it settle into her bones like a healing. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes to find him watching her. That was beautiful, she whispered. My wife loved when I played. She would dance, even when there was no reason for joy. She said music made its own reasons. He wrapped the flute carefully, returning it to its place. I thought I'd forgotten how. Perhaps some things wait for us until we're ready to remember them. He looked at her sharply, as if she'd said something profound instead of merely thinking aloud. Then he rose, moving to bank the fire for the night, but when he passed her to reach his sleeping area, he paused. Your hair, he said. The light catches it like burnished wood. I noticed before, but... He trailed off, seeming surprised at himself. Margaret's hand went unconsciously to her hair, which she'd been wearing loose more often. Finding the desert wind dried it faster after washing. It's nothing special, just brown. Mourning Dove's hair was black as obsidian. I thought no other color could be beautiful. He moved on without elaborating, leaving Margaret stunned and oddly breathless. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay on her buffalo robe, hyper-aware of every sound, the crackle of dying embers, the distant call of night birds, Samuel's steady breathing across the shelter. When had the sound of his presence become comforting rather than threatening? When had she stopped calculating distances and escape routes and started simply existing in this shared space? The next morning brought a change in routine. Samuel announced they would ride to a trading post 2 days distant. He needed ammunition and other supplies that couldn't be made or found. Is it safe? Margaret asked, anxiety creeping in. For me to go? Safer than leaving you alone. The trader is a Frenchman, asks no questions. We go, trade, leave. No towns, no crowds. They set out before dawn, Margaret riding behind Samuel on horse. She'd been nervous about riding, another skill her city upbringing had neglected, but Samuel had shown her how to move with the animal rather than against it. His patient instruction, delivered in that low, steady voice, had eased her fears. The journey revealed new aspects of the man she'd been living with. He knew every water source, every shelter, navigating by landmarks invisible to her eyes. He told her stories of the land as they rode, which canyon had been a refuge during the Apache Wars, where his people had held ceremonies, the mountain where boys went to become men. Do you miss it? She asked during one rest stop. Your people? Your old life? A man can't miss what no longer exists, he said, but the tightness in his voice betrayed him. My clan is scattered. The old ways are forbidden. What is there to miss but ghosts? They camped that night under stars so bright they seemed touchable. Samuel built a small fire, just enough for warmth and to keep predators at bay. They sat close together, the empty desert making their isolation complete. "Are you afraid?" he asked suddenly. "Of what?" "This being alone with me, far from any help." Margaret considered the question honestly. "I was afraid, at first. You were everything I'd been taught to fear, but now—" She searched for words. "Now I think I'm more afraid of going back to that other life than I am of anything out here. Even though I am Apache. Even though people say many things." She interrupted with unusual firmness. "They said I was barren. They said I was wanton. They said I poisoned my husband with my wickedness. People's words are just wind." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You have courage, more than you know. Or perhaps I've simply run out of fear. There's only so much a person can dread before it becomes tiresome." He actually smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his austere features. Spoken like a true desert dweller. They reached the trading post late the next day, a rough collection of buildings that seemed to crouch against the landscape like scavengers. The trader, Baptiste, was indeed French, a grizzled man with knowing eyes who greeted Samuel in a mixture of French, English, and Apache. Margaret stayed close to Samuel as they conducted business, aware of the curious glances from the few other patrons. She knew how they must look, a massive Apache man with a white woman trailing behind him. But Samuel's presence commanded respect, or at least wariness, and no one approached them. Baptiste's wife, a Mexican woman with kind eyes, drew Margaret aside while the men haggled. "You are well?" she asked in accented English. "He treats you good?" "Yes," Margaret answered, surprised by the woman's concern. "He saved my life." The woman nodded knowingly. "Samuel Crowhorse is a good man. Tragic what happened to his family. Maybe now the spirits give him second chance, eh?" Before Margaret could respond, the trading was done. Samuel had acquired ammunition, salt, coffee, and other necessities. But she noticed him purchase something else, something small he tucked away without showing her. The journey back was swifter, both of them eager to return to the familiar shelter of their camp. As they rode through a particularly beautiful canyon painted gold by late afternoon sun, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This wild, harsh land was beginning to feel like home in a way perdition never had. That evening, back in their shelter, Samuel presented her with his secret purchase, a small silver mirror and a bone comb. "A woman should have these things," he said gruffly. Not meeting her eyes, Margaret held the gifts carefully, overwhelmed. They were simple items, but in their world of bare necessities, they represented luxury beyond measure. More than that, they represented consideration, care, perhaps even affection. "Thank you." She managed past the lump in her throat. That night after dinner, she used the comb to work through her hair, made tangled by days of wind and travel. Samuel watched from across the fire, no longer pretending disinterest. When she struggled with a particularly stubborn knot, he rose and moved behind her. "May I?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. His hands in her hair were gentle but sure, working through the tangles with infinite patience. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the simple pleasure of human touch after so long without it. When he finished, his hands lingered for just a moment on her shoulders. The weight of them felt like a promise, though of what she couldn't say. "There," he said, stepping back. "Better." She turned to thank him and found herself caught in his dark gaze. The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing across his face. For a moment, the air grew thick with possibility. Then a coyote howled in the distance, breaking the spell. Samuel returned to his side of the fire. Margaret carefully put away her new treasures, but something had changed between them. Subtle as a shift in the wind, but just as unmistakable. As she lay down to sleep, she heard him speak softly in the darkness. "I'm glad the storm brought you to me." She smiled into the buffalo hide, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "So am I," she whispered back. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Margaret woke to find Samuel already up, but instead of being gone as usual, he was sitting by the fire, clearly waiting for her. "Today," he said. "I teach you to shoot." "Shoot?" She sat up, surprised. "But I've never—" "All the more reason to learn." He held up a rifle, checking its action with practiced movements. "The desert is not always kind. You should be able to protect yourself." They spent the morning in patient practice. Samuel showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Her first shots went wild, making her jump at the recoil, but he stood behind her, steadying her stance, his presence solid and reassuring. "Breathe," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "Make the rifle part of your body. Don't fight it." By afternoon, she was hitting the target, an old piece of wood, more often than not. Samuel nodded approval. "You learn quickly. With practice, you'll be a fine shot." "I had a good teacher," she said, flushed with accomplishment. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, Margaret made a decision. Instead of settling immediately onto her buffalo robe, she moved closer to the fire, closer to where Samuel sat. "Tell me about your childhood," she said, "before the missions, before the sorrows." He looked surprised but pleased by her interest. And so he talked, sharing stories of swimming in hidden pools, of learning to track with his grandfather, of the ceremonies that marked the seasons. Margaret listened, enchanted not just by the stories but by the way his face softened in the telling, years falling away as he remembered happier times. When he finally fell silent, she reached out and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me." He turned his hand palm up, catching her fingers for just a moment before letting go. "Thank you for listening." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire die to embers. The space between them had shrunk to mere inches, though neither seemed willing to acknowledge it. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, but somehow blessing this moment of connection between two wounded souls finding their way toward each other. The night turned cold unexpectedly, a desert contradiction that still surprised Margaret even after 2 months in this harsh land. She lay on her buffalo robe, shivering despite the heavy blanket, listening to the wind howl through the canyon like a living thing. Across the shelter, she could hear Samuel's steady breathing, somehow undisturbed by the temperature drop. Another violent shiver racked her body. She pulled the blanket tighter, but the cold seemed to seep through everything, settling into her bones with icy fingers. Pride kept her silent for a while longer, but when her teeth began chattering audibly, she heard movement from Samuel's side of the shelter. "You're cold," he said. Not a question. "I'm fine," she managed through chattering teeth. He snorted softly. "Stubborn woman. Cold can kill as surely as heat in the desert." She heard him moving, gathering something. Then he was beside her, laying another heavy hide over her blanket. But even with the added layer, the shivering wouldn't stop. "This is foolishness," he muttered. Then, more gently, "Margaret, come here." She turned to find him holding open his own blankets, creating a space beside him. The invitation was clear, as was the conflict on his face, duty warring with propriety, concern battling with the careful distance they'd maintained. I wouldn't," she started, unsure how to voice her own jumbled thoughts. "You'll freeze," he said simply, "and I'll have wasted good medicine and food keeping you alive just to lose you to pride." The practicality of it, delivered in his matter-of-fact tone, somehow made it easier. Margaret gathered her courage and her blanket, moving across the small space to settle beside him. He arranged the covers over both of them, creating a warm cocoon against the night's chill. At first, they lay rigid as boards, careful not to touch despite the shared bedding. But as warmth began to seep back into Margaret's body, she unconsciously relaxed and found herself gradually shifting closer to the heat Samuel radiated like a furnace. "Better?" he asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "Yes, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You're very warm." "Apache blood runs hot," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "My wife used to say I was her personal summer." The mention of mourning doves should have created awkwardness, but somehow it didn't. They'd reached a place where the dead could be honored without casting shadows on the living. Margaret's shivering finally stopped completely. In the warm darkness, with the wind singing its lonely song outside, she felt safer than she had in years. Samuel? I'm not going anywhere. His arm, which had been carefully positioned away from her, moved to rest lightly across her waist. I know. They slept that way, curled together like question marks forming a complete sentence. Margaret woke at dawn to find herself alone in the blankets. Though they still held Samuel's warmth, she could hear him outside, the familiar sounds of morning routine. When she emerged, he glanced at her once, something unreadable in his dark eyes, then continued preparing breakfast as if nothing had changed. But things had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained had collapsed in the night, leaving something new and fragile in its place. They moved around each other with heightened awareness now, accidental touches lingering a moment too long, glances holding meanings they weren't ready to voice. A week passed this way, dancing around the shift in their relationship. Then came the night of the full moon, when silver light turned the desert into an alien landscape of sharp shadows and ethereal beauty. Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the night sounds, remembering another full moon years ago when she'd stood in her wedding dress, young and hopeful, believing marriage would be her great adventure. How naive she'd been, thinking adventure meant safety and propriety and a husband who noticed her existence. She rose quietly and stepped outside, drawn by the moonlight. The desert stretched endlessly, transformed by the silver illumination into something magical. She'd learned to love this land, its harsh beauty and unforgiving honesty. It demanded truth from those who would survive it. Can't sleep. She didn't startle anymore at Samuel's silent approaches. The moon makes me restless. He came to stand beside her, his presence solid and comforting. The Apache believe the moon is female, the sun male. She chases him across the sky, but they can never be together long. That's sad. Perhaps their brief meetings are all the sweeter for being rare. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the moon paint the rocks with silver. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice lower, more hesitant. Margaret, these past days, I need to speak plainly. She turned to face him, heart suddenly racing. Yes? I'm not a young man. I have known loss. I thought my heart was buried with my family. He paused, struggling with words. But you've brought something back to life in me, something I thought was dead. Samuel, let me finish. He took a breath. I know what I am. Apache, older, marked by violence. You could find better. Stop. Margaret surprised herself with the firmness of her voice. You saved my life. But more than that, you gave me purpose. You look at me and see someone capable, not just a failed wife or a barren woman. Do you know how precious that is? He lifted his hand to her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. You are precious, worth more than the narrow minds of that town could ever see. Margaret leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. I used to cry every night in perdition. I haven't cried once since coming here. Is that good? Yes, because now when I feel like crying, it's not from sorrow, but from feeling too much, from being seen, from being valued. She turned her face to press a kiss to his palm. From being touched with kindness. Samuel made a sound low in his throat, part groan, part prayer. His other hand came up to frame her face, holding her like something infinitely fragile and infinitely precious. Margaret, beautiful woman, may I? She answered by rising on her toes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, tentative, as if either might bolt. Then Samuel's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of loneliness ending, of wounds beginning to heal, of life insisting on its continuation despite all loss. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Margaret found tears on her cheeks after all. Samuel wiped them away with his thumbs, concern creasing his brow. Did I? No, she assured him quickly. No, these are, I told you, too much feeling. She laughed shakily. I'd forgotten kissing could be like that, or maybe I never knew. Your husband was a fool, Samuel said with quiet vehemence, to have you and not cherish every moment. They returned to the shelter hand in hand. At the entrance, Samuel paused. Margaret, I won't assume. You're under my protection. That means from me as well if needed. She squeezed his hand. I know. That's part of why I trust you. She hesitated, then admitted. I'm not ready for everything. Not yet, but I want to be close to you. Is that enough? You are enough. Whatever you offer. Whenever you're ready. I've waited 3 years to feel alive again. I can wait longer. They settled into the blankets together. No pretense of cold driving them this time. Margaret curled into Samuel's embrace, her head on his chest where she could hear his heartbeat. Strong and steady, his arms around her felt like safety itself. Tell me something good, she whispered into the darkness. Something that has nothing to do with sorrow? Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. Then, when I was 7 winters, I found an eagle chick fallen from its nest. Everyone said to leave it, that it would die. But I was stubborn. I fed it rabbits I caught, kept it safe while it grew. One day, it flew away, and I cried like a baby. He chuckled softly. But the next spring, an eagle circled our camp for days. It dropped a rabbit at my feet and flew away. My grandmother said it was the bird returning the favor. That's beautiful. Margaret smiled against his chest. Did you believe it was the same eagle? I wanted to. Sometimes wanting to believe is enough. They lay quietly, breathing together. Then Margaret spoke. I haven't been honest with you. She felt him tense slightly. Oh? My name. It's not really Margaret. Well, it is. But I was born Margaret Rose Sullivan. I took James's name when we married, but I never felt like it fit, like I was wearing clothes cut for someone else. Margaret Rose, Samuel repeated softly. It suits you better. Like the desert rose, beautiful and strong, blooming where others would wither. No one's called me that since my mother died. Then I'm honored to be the second. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Margaret Rose. The next days passed in a haze of new intimacy. They still worked side by side, but now Samuel would catch her hand as she passed, bringing it to his lips. Margaret would lean against him as they watched the sunset, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. The careful walls they'd built had crumbled, leaving them vulnerable but no longer alone. One afternoon, as Margaret worked on expanding their shelter's storage area, she had plans to preserve more food for winter, she began humming. It took her a moment to realize what she was doing, and when she did, she stopped abruptly. Why did you stop? Samuel asked from where he was repairing a harness. I didn't realize. I haven't sung since I was a girl. Sing now, he encouraged. This place has been too quiet for too long. Self-consciously at first, then with growing confidence, Margaret began to sing an old ballad her mother had taught her. Her voice, unused for so long, was rough at first but smoothed as she continued. When she finished, she found Samuel watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Now I understand, he said softly. What? Why the Creator brought you to me, to remind me that life holds more than survival, that beauty exists even in the hardest places. He set aside his work and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. Sing whenever you wish. Let the canyon learn joy again. That night, after they'd shared their simple meal and settled by the fire, Samuel produced something from his pack, a small leather pouch he'd kept hidden. I made this for you, he said, unusually shy. It's not much. Inside the pouch was a necklace, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in silver wire, hung on a leather cord. The craftsmanship was simple but elegant, clearly made with painstaking care. Samuel, it's beautiful. Margaret held it up to the firelight, admiring how the stone seemed to hold the desert sky within its depths. When did you? The nights you slept. My hands needed work, and my mind kept turning to you." He took the necklace and moved behind her, securing it around her neck. "Turquoise is sacred to my people. It offers protection, connection to the spirits. But mostly, I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that marks you as—" He paused. "As what?" she asked softly. "As precious, as claimed, if you'll allow it. As mine, if you want to be." Margaret turned in his arms, the turquoise warm against her throat. "I want to be, I am, yours." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and she responded with equal fervor. When they parted, both were trembling. "Margaret Rose," he said roughly. "Beautiful woman, you test my control. Maybe I don't want your control," she admitted, surprising herself with her boldness. His eyes darkened, but he stepped back slightly. "Not like this, not rushed. When we come together fully, I want it to be right, sacred. You deserve that." "After everything that's happened to us both, who decides what's right?" "We do," he said simply. "And I decide that you deserve courtship, time, gentleness, all the things that were stolen from you before." Margaret's eyes filled. No one had ever considered what she deserved, least of all herself. "You're going to make me cry again. Tears of joy I can bear," he said, wiping her eyes. "It's the other kind I never want to cause." They held each other by the dying fire, content for now with closeness, with the promise of a future neither had dared imagine. The desert night wrapped around them like a blessing, and for the first time in years, both believed they might deserve happiness after all. The riders appeared at midday, their dust cloud visible long before Margaret could make out individual forms. She was alone at the shelter, Samuel having left at dawn to check his trap lines in the northern canyons. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle he'd insisted she keep close, but she didn't raise it yet. Travelers occasionally passed through this remote area, and unnecessary hostility could create more problems than it solved. But as the riders drew closer, her heart sank. She recognized the lead horse, and worse, its rider, Josiah Holsworth, her brother-in-law, accompanied by 3 men she didn't know, hard-faced men who wore their guns like familiar tools. Margaret stepped out of the shelter's shadow, rifle held loosely but visibly. The turquoise at her throat seemed to burn against her skin. Well, Josiah drawled, reining in his mount at what he clearly considered a safe distance. "The rumors were true. Margaret Holsworth, living in sin with a savage." "I'm not a Holsworth anymore," Margaret said, proud of how steady her voice remained. "And I'll ask you to leave. You're not welcome here." Josiah's laugh was ugly. "Not welcome? You forget yourself, woman. You're still family by law, and the family has interest to protect." One of his companions, a lean man with dead eyes, spoke up. "This the one. Holsworth doesn't look like much. Don't let appearances fool you. Garrett, she murdered my brother sure as if she'd put a knife in him. Poison, the doctor suspects now. Slow acting, made it look like fever. That's a lie," Margaret said, anger overcoming fear. "James died of drink and stubbornness, refusing medicine until it was too late. You know that, Josiah. I know my mother's heart is broken. I know the family name is ruined, and I know you're out here consorting with heathens like the Jezebel you are." His eyes glittered with something that made Margaret's skin crawl. "But family's family. We've come to take you back." No. Josiah's voice turned silky. "You'd rather stay here, playing squaw to some Apache buck. Have you no shame at all?" "I have no shame in choosing life over the slow death your family offered." Margaret raised the rifle slightly. "I won't go with you." The men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing. A woman alone with a rifle was one thing. A woman who held it like she knew how to use it was another. "Now, let's be reasonable," Josiah said, but his hand was moving slowly toward his sidearm. "You come quiet like, and..." The shot came from behind and to the left of the shelter, the bullet kicking up dust inches from Josiah's horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating him. Before any of them could react, Samuel emerged from the rocks like a shadow given form, his own rifle trained on the group. "The lady said you're not welcome," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. The hired men went for their guns, but Samuel's next words stopped them cold. "4 of you, 1 of me. Seems unfair." He smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "For you—" Margaret had never seen him like this, the warrior he'd once been showing through the quiet man she knew. He moved with predatory grace, positioning himself between her and the threat, never taking his eyes off the riders. "So you're the Apache," Josiah said, recovering his composure. "Bigger than expected. No matter. We've come for what's ours. She belongs to no one but herself." Samuel replied, "But if we're talking claims, she's under my protection. That means something in these lands." "Your protection?" Garrett laughed. "What's the protection of a savage worth?" Samuel's shot took the hat off Garrett's head before anyone saw him move. "More than your life. Apparently, next one goes lower." "You can't fight all of us," Josiah blustered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No need. I know you. Josiah Holsworth. Know your type. Cowards who hire other men to do their killing. These men here, they're calculating odds, wondering if your money's worth dying for." Samuel's smile widened. "It's not." One of the unnamed riders spoke up. "Holsworth, you said this would be easy. Grab a woman. You said—" "You didn't mention no Apache," another added. "Especially not one that shoots like that." "I'm paying you." "Not enough for this," Garrett interrupted, settling his ruined hat back on his head. "I've heard of this one. Samuel Crowhorse. Used to scout for the army until they killed his family. They say he took 15 soldiers with him when he left their service." 20, Samuel corrected mildly. "But who counts?" The riders were already turning their horses, professional survival instincts overcoming greed. Josiah found himself suddenly alone, his face flushing red with rage and embarrassment. "This isn't over," he snarled. "She's a murderess and a whore, and justice will—" Samuel's rifle barked again, and Josiah's saddle horn exploded into leather fragments. His horse, thoroughly spooked now, took the bit and ran. Josiah's curses faded with distance as he fought to control his mount. Samuel stood watching until the dust settled, then slowly lowered his rifle. The transformation was remarkable, the dangerous warrior melting away, leaving the gentleman Margaret knew. He turned to her, concern replacing cold fury. "Are you hurt?" "No." Then reaction hit, and Margaret found herself shaking. "How did you—" "You were supposed to be at the trap lines. Horse told me trouble was coming." Her ears said riders from the east, moving with purpose. He gathered her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and sage. "I'm sorry you had to face them alone even for a moment." "I wasn't afraid," she said, surprising herself to find it was true. "I knew you'd come. Always." He promised. "But they'll be back. Men like that don't accept defeat well." "Then what do we do?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, then pulled back to look at her. "We could run, head deeper into the mountains, maybe north to Colorado territory. I know places where no one would find us. Or we make our stand, but not as two people living in sin, giving them ammunition for their righteousness." He cupped her face in his hands. Margaret rose. "I would take you as my wife, if you'll have me. Not in their way, but properly, legally. Let them try to take a man's lawful wife." Margaret's breath caught. "Samuel, is this because of them? Because I don't want—" "No." His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "I've wanted to ask for days now, but couldn't find the words. Maybe threat makes cowards of us all. Or maybe it makes us brave enough to say what matters. I love you." Margaret rose. "Not because you need protection, but because you make my heart beat again. Because you brought music back to these canyons. Because you look at me and see a man, not a savage." "Oh, Samuel." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Yes, of course, yes." I love you too. I think I have since you played that flute, making beauty in the darkness. He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and she responded with everything in her. When they parted, both were breathless. We need witnesses, Samuel said practically, though his eyes still burned with emotion. The traitor, Baptiste, he's also a justice of the peace, recognized by the territory. If we marry before him, with witnesses, it's legal as any church wedding. When? Tomorrow. If we ride hard, before your brother-in-law can gather more men or think of another plan. They spent the afternoon preparing for the journey, but Margaret noticed Samuel taking extra precautions, loading additional ammunition, checking sight lines around their shelter, teaching her hand signals for danger. The warrior hadn't gone far beneath the surface. That night, their last before becoming husband and wife, they lay together under the stars. Samuel had suggested sleeping outside, where the view was unobstructed and threats would be easier to spot. But Margaret suspected he also wanted to give her this beauty to counter the day's ugliness. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Marriage to me means accepting all that comes with it. The prejudice, the danger, the... Samuel. She turned in his arms to face him. I've lived with prejudice and danger while married to a white man who never saw me as more than a disappointment. With you, I'm Margaret Rose, who can shoot and ride and survive in the desert, who's worth protecting, worth courting, worth loving. She kissed him softly. That's worth any price. My fierce desert rose, he murmured against her lips. Tomorrow you'll be my wife-in-law, but in my heart, you already are. They left before dawn, riding hard through landscapes painted in shades of pink and gold. Horse carried them both easily, seeming to sense the urgency. They stopped only when necessary, Samuel constantly scanning their back trail for pursuit. Do you think they'll follow? Margaret asked during one brief rest. Not yet. Men like that need time to work up courage, make plans. We have a day, maybe two. They reached Baptiste's trading post as the sun touched the western mountains. The Frenchman's eyebrows rose when Samuel explained their need, but he nodded without hesitation. Oui, I can do this, but witnesses, you need two besides myself. I'll stand witness, a voice said from behind them. They turned to find a weathered man in dusty black, a traveling preacher Margaret remembered seeing at the post during their last visit. Brother Marcus Wellington, I may not approve of all circumstances, but I won't see love thwarted by hate. Baptiste's wife, Maria, stepped forward. And I witness too. Is good. What you do. Love is blessing, no matter what others say. The ceremony was simple, held in the main room of the trading post with trade goods and supplies as silent attendees. Samuel had no ring to offer, but he removed a silver band from his own finger, something Margaret had never seen him without. This was my father's, he explained quietly. Given to him by my mother when they married. It's all I have of them, all I can offer you. It's perfect, Margaret whispered, sliding it onto her thumb where it fit snugly. Brother Marcus performed the ceremony with surprising eloquence, speaking of love tested by trials, of two souls finding each other across impossible divides. When he reached the vows, Samuel spoke first. Margaret Rose, you came to me in a storm, and you became my peace. I promise to protect you, provide for you, cherish you as long as breath fills my body. You are my heart returned to me. Margaret's voice trembled but carried clearly. Samuel Crowhorse, you saved my life and then gave me reason to live it. I promise to stand beside you, to be your partner in all things, to love you until the stars fall from the sky. Then, by the power vested in me by the Arizona Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Brother Marcus smiled. What God and the law have joined, let no man tear asunder. Samuel kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to Maria's eyes. Even Baptiste cleared his throat suspiciously. Now, the trader said, producing a bottle of good whiskey. We celebrate properly. No. But Samuel shook his head. We need to travel through the night. They'll come here first when they discover we've gone. Then take this." Baptiste pressed a wrapped package into Margaret's hands. "Wedding gift. And this," he handed Samuel extra ammunition. "Other wedding gift. May you need the first more than the second." They left as darkness fell, taking a different route back. One Samuel said was known only to Apache and desperate men. Margaret rode in front of him now, his arms around her, keeping her secure as horse picked her way through treacherous terrain by moonlight. "My wife," Samuel murmured into her hair during one of their brief rests. "I like how that sounds." "My husband," she replied, turning to kiss him. "I never thought I'd say those words with joy." They reached their shelter as dawn broke, exhausted but alert. Samuel immediately began preparations for defense, while Margaret unpacked Baptiste's gift, preserves, real coffee, and miracle of miracles, a small wedding cake Maria must have hastily prepared. "She knew we'd come," Margaret said wonderingly. "Women know things." Samuel agreed. "Now rest. I'll keep watch." "We'll keep watch together," she corrected. "Partners, remember?" He smiled, the expression transforming his tired features. "How did I survive without you to correct my foolishness?" "You didn't," she said simply. "You existed, just as I did. Now we live." They set up defensive positions, prepared water and food for a siege, and waited. But the day passed peacefully, with only the usual desert sounds. As night fell, Samuel finally relaxed slightly. "Maybe they've given up," Margaret suggested. "Maybe," but he didn't sound convinced. "More likely they're planning something we haven't thought of." That night, for the first time, they came together as husband and wife, in the shelter that had become their home, with starlight filtering through gaps in the stone. They claimed each other fully. It was nothing like Margaret's wedding night with James, that awkward, painful fumbling that had set the tone for their marriage. With Samuel, there was reverence in every touch, worship in every kiss. He made love to her like she was precious beyond measure, and she responded with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. Afterwards, they lay entwined, skin to skin, heart to heart. "My beautiful wife," Samuel whispered, pressing kisses to her shoulder. "My rose who blooms in the desert." "My husband," she replied, tracing the scar on his chest. "My warrior who chooses gentleness." "I choose you," he corrected. "Always. Only you." They slept deeply, exhausted by travel and emotion and the sweet exertion of newfound intimacy, which is why they almost missed the smoke. Margaret woke to Samuel's hand over her mouth, his body tense beside her. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could smell it. Smoke, but not from their banked fire. This was different, acrid and wrong. Her eyes widened in understanding, and he removed his hand. "They're trying to smoke us out," he whispered. "Stay low. The smoke rises, but we need to move." They dressed quickly and silently, gathering only essentials: water, ammunition, the medicine bag Samuel always carried. The smoke was thickening, seeping through cracks in their shelter. Outside, Margaret could see the glow of fires set around the base of their rocky refuge. "Cowards," Samuel muttered. "Can't face us directly, so they try this." "How many?" Margaret asked, checking her rifle as he'd taught her. "I count 6 fires, so at least that many men, maybe more." He touched her face briefly. "We go up, to the high caves. I know passages they don't. Can you climb?" "I'll manage." They slipped out through a narrow opening Samuel had long ago prepared for such an escape. The climb was treacherous in the darkness, made worse by the need for silence. Margaret's dress caught and tore on the rocks. Her hands scraped raw, but she pressed on, following Samuel's sure movements. Halfway up, voices drifted from below. "They'll come out soon enough." Josiah's voice, smugly confident. "No one can breathe that smoke for long." "And if they've already gone?" another asked. "Where would they go? The Apache knows every lawman in the territory has a price on his head. And she's wanted for murder now. I've made sure of that. They'll run to ground like the animals they are." Margaret's blood burned at the lies, but Samuel touched her ankle, a warning to stillness. They continued climbing until they reached a shallow cave he'd shown her weeks ago, a last resort refuge with stored water and a hidden exit. As dawn broke, they could see the full extent of their situation. At least a dozen men surrounded their former home, feeding fires that sent black smoke billowing into the morning sky. Their shelter, their first refuge together, was being destroyed. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "This is because of me." "No," Samuel's voice was firm. "This is because small men can't bear to see others find happiness. It would have come eventually, one way or another." They watched as the men below grew frustrated, realizing their prey had escaped. Josiah's curses echoed off the canyon walls. Then one of the men pointed up the cliff face, having spotted something, perhaps disturbed rocks from their climb. "Up there! They went up!" "So we wait," another said. "They'll need water eventually. Post men at every spring within riding distance. Or," Josiah said slowly, "we give them reason to come down." He turned to his men. "Garrett, take 3 men back to the trading post. The Frenchmen help them. I'd wager. Bring him and his wife here." "You want us to kidnap citizens?" Garrett sounded uncertain. "I want you to arrest conspirators harboring fugitives." Josiah corrected smoothly. "My family has influence. Papers can be drawn up later to make it legal." Samuel's hand clenched on his rifle, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "No, you can't fight them all. I won't let them hurt innocents because of us. And I won't let you die in some pointless battle." She thought quickly. The back exit from this cave. Where does it lead? Over the ridge, down to Skeleton Canyon. "But—" "Then we run. We get to Baptiste first, warn them. Then we keep going, like you said, north to Colorado, or west to California, somewhere they can't follow." Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd become his wife, seeing the steel beneath the softness. "You'd leave everything behind." "Everything I care about is right here," she said simply. "The rest is just things." They made their escape as the sun climbed higher, using knowledge of the terrain that the hunters lacked. By the time Garrett and his men reached the trading post, Samuel and Margaret were already there, having pushed horse to her limits. Baptiste took one look at their faces and began loading his shotgun. "How many?" "Too many," Samuel said. "They're coming for you and Maria, because you helped us. Then we leave too." Maria said practically, "I have cousin in Tucson. We go there until this passes." "It won't pass," Margaret said. "Not while Josiah lives. He's made this a matter of pride now." "Then perhaps," a new voice said from the doorway. "It's time someone reminded Mr. Holsworth that pride goeth before a fall." They turned to find Brother Marcus, the traveling preacher, but he looked different now. Instead of dusty black clothes, he wore travel leathers and carried himself with an authority that had been hidden before. Most surprisingly, he wore a U.S.O. Marshal's badge. "Marshal Theodore Marcus, at your service," he said with a slight smile. "Brother Marcus, when it suits my purposes. I've been tracking certain activities in this territory for months. The Holsworth family's interesting financial arrangements, for instance, their connections to claimed jumpers and rustlers." "You're a lawman?" Margaret gasped. "Indeed. And you, Mrs. Crowhorse, are not wanted for any crime, despite what Mr. Holsworth claims. I checked before performing your wedding. Clean as fresh snow, legally speaking." He turned to Samuel. "You, sir, are another matter." "There are some questions about an incident with soldiers 3 years back. They murdered his family," Margaret said fiercely. "So I gathered, and interestingly, several soldiers from that unit have recently confessed to participating in unsanctioned raids on Apache camps. Seems their captain was selling supplies meant for the reservation and needed to cover the shortages by claiming Apache raids required punitive action." The marshal's eyes were sympathetic. "The territorial governor is considering pardons for Apaches who fought back during such illegal actions." "Considering isn't doing," Samuel said flatly. "No, but it's a start. And a legal marriage to a citizen of good standing helps your case considerably." Marcus moved to the window, watching the road. "Here's what I propose. You folks stay put. When Mr. Holsworth arrives with his hired guns, he'll find a U.S. Marshal waiting. Men like him fold quickly when faced with actual authority." "And if they don't fold?" Samuel asked. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Then they'll discover why I've survived 10 years wearing this badge in territories where law is more suggestion than fact." They didn't have long to wait. Garrett and 3 men rode in hard, guns already drawn. The sight of a marshal's badge stopped them cold. "Gentlemen," Marcus called out calmly, "I'll need you to holster those weapons. This is a lawful establishment, and you're disturbing the peace." "We're here on Holsworth business," Garrett said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "And I'm here on federal business, which trumps Holsworth business considerably." Marcus stepped fully into view. "In fact, I've been looking into the Holsworth family's various enterprises. Amazing how much paperwork turns up when you start digging. False claims, forged documents, intimidation of witnesses." "We don't know nothing about that," one of the men said quickly. "I'm sure you don't. Men like you just follow orders, collect pay. Speaking of which," Marcus produced a paper. "This warrant names Josiah Holsworth and several associates. Any man who helps me serve it will be looked upon favorably. Any man who interferes will be charged with obstruction." The hired guns exchanged glances. The arithmetic was simple. Holsworth's money against federal prison. "We were just leaving," Garrett announced. "Got word of work up in Prescott." They turned their horses and rode out without looking back. Marcus chuckled. "Professional killers are remarkably practical people." "Josiah won't be," Margaret warned. "He's got too much pride to back down." "Then we'd best go explain his options to him," Marcus said. He looked at Samuel. "I could use a deputy who knows the terrain, temporary appointment, but it would make you a lawman instead of an outlaw. Interested?" Samuel looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm interested." The ride back to their shelter was surreal. Margaret had left as a fugitive. She returned as a marshal's deputy's wife. The smoke had cleared, revealing damage to their home but not total destruction. Josiah and his remaining men were still there, arguing about their next move. "Josiah Holsworth," Marshal Marcus called out. "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about 6 other charges I'll think of by the time we reach Tucson." Josiah spun around, his face purpling with rage. You're supposed to be a preacher." "I contain multitudes," Marcus replied dryly. "Will you come quietly, or do we do this the hard way? You think some tin badge scares me? My family owns half this territory." "Actually," Marcus said conversationally, "they don't. Those land claims you've been enforcing? Forgeries. That judge who's been ruling in your favor, currently explaining himself to federal prosecutors, your mother's fortune, tied up in legal challenges that will take years to resolve." He smiled. "You should have left well enough alone, Mr. Holsworth, but you had to chase a woman who didn't want you, hurt people who did nothing but try to live in peace. Pride. Mr. Holsworth. It'll kill you every time." Josiah went for his gun. He was fast, but Samuel was faster. The shot was clean, precise, taking Josiah in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. His remaining men threw down their weapons immediately. "Excellent shooting, Deputy," Marcus observed. "Non-lethal but decisive. We'll make a lawman of you yet." As they secured the prisoners and tended Josiah's wound, Margaret stood looking at their damaged shelter. Samuel came to stand beside her. "We can repair it," he said. "Make it home again. Or," she said slowly, "we could build something new, something that's ours from the beginning." He put his arm around her. "What did you have in mind?" "There's good land near the trading post. Baptiste mentioned settlers are coming, that there might even be a town someday. We could ranch, cattle, horses, build a real house." She looked up at him. "Unless you need to stay hidden here." "I've been hiding for 3 years." Samuel said, "Maybe it's time to try living in the open again. With my wife, my legal, law-abiding wife." Margaret laughed, the sound bright as water in the desert. Listen to us, making plans like respectable people. Why not? We're respectable now. The marshal said so. Samuel Crowhorse, respectable rancher. She tested the words. I like it. Margaret Rose Crowhorse, rancher's wife. He kissed her temple. I like that better. Marshal Marcus approached, prisoners secured and ready for transport. I'll need statements from you both, but that can wait until we reach Tucson. The governor will want to meet you. Samuel, that pardon we discussed, I think it's about to become more than a consideration. Thank you, Samuel said simply. Don't thank me. Thank your wife. Her courage in standing up to these thugs caught my attention. That and Baptiste's letters to the territorial authorities about Holsworth harassment. He tipped his hat to Margaret. Ma'am, you've got friends you didn't even know about. As the marshal and his prisoners departed, leaving Samuel and Margaret alone at their damaged shelter, a sense of possibility filled the air. The worst had happened. They'd been discovered, hunted, nearly killed, but they'd survived. And more than that, they'd won the right to live freely. So, Margaret said, beginning to salvage what she could from their shelter. Where do we start? We start here, Samuel said, catching her hands and drawing her close. With us, everything else builds from that. They spent the night in their damaged shelter one last time, making love among their scattered possessions while stars looked down through gaps in the roof. In the morning, they would go to the trading post, begin the process of building a new life in the open. There would be challenges. Prejudice didn't die just because the law said it should, but they would face them together, legally wed, officially pardoned, and deeply in love. No regrets? Samuel asked as they lay together. Dawn approaching. Only one, Margaret said. I wish we'd found each other sooner. We found each other when we were meant to, he replied. When we were ready. When we could see past everything that should have kept us apart to everything that brings us together. My wise husband, she murmured, kissing him. My brave wife, he responded, holding her close. Outside, the desert began its daily transformation, shadows retreating before the advancing light. A new day was dawning, full of promise and possibility, and in their shelter, two souls who had thought themselves forever broken discovered that sometimes the mended places are the strongest of all. The small house rose from the desert floor like a promise kept, its adobe walls the color of sunset and possibility. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Josiah, 6 months of hard work and harder choices. But Samuel and Margaret had built something real on the patch of land near Baptiste's trading post. It wasn't grand, just 3 rooms and a covered porch, but it was theirs, legal and proper, with papers filed at the territorial office. Margaret stood in the doorway of their bedroom, one hand pressed to her lower belly where a secret grew. She hadn't told Samuel yet, wanting to be certain, but Maria had confirmed it yesterday with the wisdom of a woman who delivered half the babies in the territory. After 4 years of marriage to James with no quickening, she'd believed the cruel words about her barrenness, but here, with Samuel, her body had remembered its purpose. You're thinking heavy thoughts, Samuel said from behind her, his arms encircling her waist. He'd been working with the horses. They had 6 now, the beginnings of the ranch they'd dreamed of. Good thoughts, she corrected, turning in his embrace. The best thoughts. She'd tell him tonight, she decided, after dinner, when they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. For now, she simply held her secret close, marveling at how life insisted on continuing despite all odds. The trading post had become the center of a small but growing community. Other settlers had arrived, drawn by promises of good land and water rights. There was talk of a school, even a church. Samuel had been wary at first. Too many people meant too many chances for conflict. But most of the newcomers were like them, people looking for fresh starts rather than old troubles. Mrs. Crowhorse, a voice called from the road. Margaret shaded her eyes to see Dr. Edmund Carthage approaching on his mule. The young physician had arrived 2 months ago, fleeing some scandal in Boston that he wouldn't discuss. He'd taken one look at their unusual marriage and simply asked if they needed medical supplies, winning their cautious friendship. "Doctor," she greeted him. "What brings you out this way?" "House call to the Hendersons. Their youngest has croup again." He dismounted, accepting the cup of water she offered. "Actually, I'm glad I caught you both. There's something you should know. A group of Apache passed through yesterday, asking about Samuel." Samuel appeared from the barn, instantly alert. "Asking what?" "If you were well, if you were happy." The doctor looked uncomfortable. "They wouldn't say more, but I got the impression they'd been looking for you for some time." Samuel's face went carefully blank, the expression Margaret recognized as his way of processing difficult emotions. He'd cut all ties with his people after the massacre, but blood called to blood in ways that couldn't be entirely severed. "Did they say they'd return?" Samuel asked. "No. But they didn't seem hostile. More curious? Perhaps hopeful?" After the doctor left, Samuel was quiet. He worked with violent energy, repairing things that didn't need repairing, speaking only when necessary. Margaret let him be, understanding that some struggles had to be fought alone before they could be shared. That evening, as they sat on their porch, she finally broke the silence. "Do you want to find them? Your people?" "They're not my people anymore," he said automatically, then sighed. "That's not true. They'll always be my people. But I chose a different path. Chose you. Chose this." He gestured at their small homestead. "I don't regret it. But sometimes I wonder if I'm a coward, running from what I am instead of trying to bridge two worlds." Margaret took his hand. "You're the bravest man I know, and bridges can be built from both sides." She took a deep breath. "Besides, you might want your child to know both parts of their heritage." Samuel went very still. "Margaret? I'm with child," she said softly. "Maria says about 3 months along, due in the winter." The transformation of his face was something she'd remember forever. Joy, wonder, and terror warred for dominance, finally settling into an expression of such tender protectiveness that tears sprang to her eyes. "A child," he breathed. "Our child, Margaret. Is everything? I'm healthy as a horse, according to Maria, a bit tired, a bit sick in the mornings. But she says that's normal." She pressed his hand to her still flat belly. "We made life, Samuel, from all that death and sorrow. We made life." He pulled her into his lap, holding her as if she were spun glass. "I need to build more rooms," he said, mind already racing. "A proper nursery, maybe hire help for the heavy work. You shouldn't be—" "Samuel," she laughed, stopping his planning with a kiss. "We have time, right now. Just be happy with me." They sat together as stars emerged, planning quietly, until the sound of horses made them both tense. But the riders who appeared in their yard weren't threats. It was Baptiste and Marshal Marcus, both looking pleased with themselves. "We bring news," Baptiste called out. "Good news, we think." They gathered around the kitchen table, Margaret serving coffee she could barely stomach anymore, though she hid her discomfort. "The governor signed your pardon," Marcus announced, producing an official document. "Full and complete. You're no longer a wanted man. Samuel, in fact," he produced another paper. "There's a request here for your services as a scout and translator. Seems the Army's trying a new approach, actual communication with the Apache bands. They want someone who can speak both languages and, more importantly, be trusted by both sides." Samuel studied the papers. "Why would I help the Army after what they did?" "Because," Marcus said gently, "the alternative is more massacres, more children dying. The man in charge of this initiative, Captain William Brennan, is different. He lost his own family to violence, Confederate raiders during the war. He understands loss, understands the futility of endless revenge." "Think about it," Baptiste added. "You could help prevent what happened to you from happening to others." Samuel looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll think about it," he said finally. After their guests left, Samuel sat staring at the papers. Everything changes, he said quietly. Everything has been changing, Margaret pointed out. This just makes it official. That night, they made love with extra tenderness, aware of the new life between them. Samuel whispered to her belly in Apache, words she didn't understand but that sounded like blessings. She ran her fingers through his hair, marveling at how far they'd come from that first terrifying meeting in a sandstorm. The next weeks passed in a blur of morning sickness and preparation. Samuel threw himself into improving their home, adding rooms with help from neighbors who'd become friends. Margaret worked on baby clothes when her stomach allowed, taught letters to the handful of children who gathered at their house since she was the only one with education enough to serve as teacher. It was during one of these impromptu lessons that the Apache returned. Margaret looked up from helping young Tom Henderson with his alphabet to find 3 native riders at the edge of their property. Samuel emerged from the barn, his whole body going tight with recognition. The lead rider, an elderly man with eyes like Samuel's, dismounted slowly. The 2 men faced each other across years of separation and change. "Nephew," the old man said in accented English. "You look well, Uncle." Samuel's voice was thick with emotion. "Joseph Crowfeather, I thought you were dead." "Many thought you were dead, but stories came. A warrior who lived alone, then took a white woman, then fought for her against many enemies." The old man's eyes moved to Margaret. "This is her?" "My wife, Margaret Rose. Margaret. This is my mother's brother." Margaret rose carefully. The pregnancy was beginning to show now, and nodded respectfully. "You're welcome here," she said, hoping she struck the right tone. Joseph studied her with those penetrating eyes, then smiled. "You have courage. Good. My nephew always needed a woman with courage." His gaze dropped to her belly. "And you carry his child. Better." The children had scattered at the appearance of the Apache, running home with stories that would probably grow in the telling. Margaret sighed, knowing there would be consequences. But Samuel was already inviting his uncle and companions inside. The conversation that followed was partly in English, partly in Apache. Margaret understood enough to know they were discussing family. Who lived? Who had died? Who had been forced onto reservations and who still roamed free? It was a litany of loss that made her heart ache. "Some of the young men speak of war," Joseph said eventually. "They see you living free, married to a white woman, and they wonder if this is the path forward." "It's one path," Samuel said carefully. "Not the only one, not right for everyone. But Margaret and we prove something, that the divide isn't insurmountable, that people can choose love over hate." "Pretty words," one of the younger Apaches said dismissively. "But words don't stop bullets." "No," Samuel agreed. "But they can prevent bullets from being fired in the first place. I've been asked to serve as translator, to help find peace between our peoples." "You would help the blue coats?" The young man's voice was incredulous. "I would help prevent more children from growing up without fathers, more women from keening over dead husbands, more—" He stopped, touching his chest where the old scar lay. "More men from carrying wounds that never heal." Joseph nodded slowly. "This is wisdom. Hard wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless." He stood. "We go now, but we will return. Your child should know their clan, their stories." "He will," Margaret said firmly, then blushed. "Or she. They'll know where they come from, both sides." After the Apache left, Samuel sat heavily, head in his hands. "I don't know if I can do this, be a bridge between worlds that seem determined to destroy each other." Margaret knelt beside him, awkward with her changing body but needing to offer comfort. "You don't have to save everyone. Just do what you can. One conversation at a time, one choice at a time." The impact of the Apache visit rippled through their small community. Some neighbors pulled back, suddenly wary. Others, like the Hendersons and Dr. Carthage, made a point of continuing their friendships. It was a preview. Margaret knew of what their child would face: acceptance and rejection in equal measure. 2 weeks later, Captain Brennan arrived. He was younger than Margaret expected, with tired eyes and a sincere manner. He didn't try to minimize the Army's past crimes or make grand promises. Instead, he laid out a simple proposition: help him prevent bloodshed wherever possible. "I'm not asking you to betray your people," Brennan said. "I'm asking you to help me find ways for all people to live on this land without killing each other. Maybe that's naive, but I have to try." Samuel accepted. Not for the Army, not even for peace in abstract, but for the child growing in Margaret's womb who would have to live in whatever world they left behind. The work was hard, often heartbreaking. Samuel would leave for days, sometimes weeks, returning exhausted and discouraged. But sometimes he came back with victories, a conflict avoided, a misunderstanding cleared, lives saved on both sides. Margaret managed the ranch in his absences, her pregnancy advancing with the changing seasons. The neighbors who'd stuck by them helped when needed, and she was never truly alone. The house Samuel had reinforced and expanded felt safe, a sanctuary in an uncertain world. One evening in late autumn, with her belly round and movements increasingly awkward, Margaret sat on the porch watching the sunset. Samuel had been gone 10 days on a particularly delicate negotiation. She missed him fiercely, wanted him there to feel the baby's increasingly strong movements. Then she saw the dust cloud on the road. Her hand went to the rifle. Samuel had insisted she keep it close, but relaxed as she recognized Horse's familiar gait. He was home. But as he drew closer, she saw he wasn't alone. A small figure sat in front of him in the saddle, a child. Samuel dismounted carefully, helping the boy down. The child couldn't have been more than 5. Clearly Apache, clearly traumatized. "His name is James Winterhawk," Samuel said quietly. "His parents were killed in a raid, not Army, but settlers who didn't know or care about the difference between hostile and peaceful bands. He has no one." Margaret looked at the boy, seeing Samuel's past reflected in those 2 old eyes. Without hesitation, she held out her hand. "Hello, James. Are you hungry? I have stew cooking." The boy looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly, slowly, like a wild animal learning to trust. The child took her hand. That night, after James had eaten and been tucked into the small bed in what would have been the nursery, Samuel and Margaret lay together, her back pressed to his chest, his hand splayed over her belly. "You didn't ask," he said softly. "I didn't need to. He needs a home. We have one." She covered his hand with hers. "Our child will have a brother." Margaret rose Crowhorse. He murmured against her hair. "Have I told you today that you're extraordinary?" "Not since breakfast," she said lightly, then grew serious. "We're making a different kind of family, aren't we? All mixed up and complicated. The best kind," he assured her. "Built on choice instead of just blood, on love instead of obligation." As if in agreement, the baby kicked strongly. In the next room, James whimpered in his sleep, and Samuel rose to comfort him, singing softly in Apache. Margaret listened, hand on her belly, heart full of a love that seemed to encompass not just her husband and the children in their care, but the whole messy, painful, beautiful experiment of their life together. Winter was coming. Her time was near. And despite all the challenges ahead, raising a mixed-race child and an orphaned boy in a world that wouldn't always be kind to either, Margaret had never felt more ready for what came next. Winter arrived with unusual ferocity that year, bringing snow that was rare in their part of the Arizona territory. Margaret, heavy with child, moved slowly through their home, preparing for the birth while caring for young James, who had begun to open like a flower in sunlight under their care. The boy still woke with nightmares, still flinched at sudden movements, but he'd also begun to smile and had taken to following Samuel around like a shadow when he was home. "The snow means something," James said one morning, his small face serious as he watched the white flakes fall. "Grandmother always said snow in the desert means the spirits are preparing for something important." Margaret smoothed his dark hair. This child who'd become theirs through tragedy but was no less loved for it. "Then we'd better be prepared too." Samuel had been gone for 3 days, helping Captain Brennan mediate a dispute over water rights that threatened to explode into violence. Margaret tried not to worry, but the baby seemed to sense her unease, moving restlessly. Maria had checked on her yesterday, pronouncing everything normal but suggesting the birth would come soon. That evening, as she prepared dinner with James's eager but clumsy help, the first pain struck. It was different from the false starts she'd experienced, deeper, more insistent. She gripped the table edge, breathing through it. "Mama?" James had taken to calling her that, and it never failed to move her. "Are you hurt?" "No, sweetheart. The baby's just telling us it might be time to come meet us." She kept her voice calm despite her rising anxiety. Samuel should be here. She'd imagined this moment so many times, and always with him beside her. Another pain came, stronger. The snow was falling harder now, and she knew she needed help. "James, can you be very brave? I need you to ride to Aunt Maria's house and tell her the baby is coming." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded solemnly. Margaret helped him bundle up, fighting through another contraction. She watched from the doorway as he mounted the gentle mare they'd been teaching him to ride, looking impossibly small but determined. "Be careful," she called. "Follow the road markers like Papa showed you." Alone, Margaret tried to stay calm. She built up the fire, laid out clean cloths, put water on to heat. The pains were coming regularly now, each one stealing her breath. She found herself talking to the baby, to Samuel though he was miles away, to her own mother who died when she was 16. "Not yet, little one," she whispered. "Wait for your papa. Please wait." But babies kept their own time. The storm intensified, and Margaret's labor progressed with relentless determination. She was on her knees by the fireplace, gripping a chair, when she heard horses outside. Relief flooded through her until she realized there were too many hoofbeats for just Maria. The door burst open, bringing snow and wind and Samuel, his face wild with fear that transformed to focused determination when he saw her. "Margaret." He was beside her in an instant, supporting her weight. "Maria sent James to the army post. I rode like the devil himself was behind me." "The baby?" she gasped. "It's coming now. I can't. Samuel, I'm frightened." "I'm here. You're the strongest woman I know. We'll do this together." His voice was steady, but she could feel his hands trembling as he helped her to their bed. Maria arrived minutes later, taking charge with the efficiency of experience. "Doctor." Carthage was trapped by the storm on the other side of the valley, but Maria had delivered hundreds of babies. She examined Margaret with gentle hands and pronounced everything progressing normally. "But it hurts," Margaret gasped, gripping Samuel's hand hard enough to leave marks. "It's supposed to hurt," Maria said matter-of-factly. "That's how you know it's working." Pain brings life. You know this. The hours blended together in a haze of contractions and brief respites. Samuel never left her side, wiping her face with cool cloths, supporting her when she needed to move, whispering encouragement in English and Apache. James had been sent to stay with the Hendersons, but Margaret could feel his concern across the distance. "I can't," she said at one point, exhausted beyond measure. "I'm not strong enough." "You are," Samuel insisted. "You survived the desert. You survived that town's cruelty. You rebuilt yourself from nothing. You can do this." The storm howled outside, but inside, the ancient rhythm of birth continued. Maria's calm instructions, Samuel's steady presence, and Margaret's own deep well of determination carried her through. When Maria finally said it was time to push, Margaret found reserves she didn't know existed. "I see the head," Maria announced. "Dark hair like the father. One more push. Margaret, one more." With a cry that came from her soul, Margaret bore down. She felt the baby slide free, heard the miraculous sound of a newborn's first wail. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, she saw Maria lift a small, perfect form. "A daughter," Maria announced, cleaning the baby with practiced movements. "Small but strong. Listen to those lungs." Samuel's face was wet with tears as Maria placed the baby on Margaret's chest. The infant quieted immediately, blinking up at her parents with dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. "Hello, little one," Margaret whispered, touching the impossibly soft cheek. "Oh, Samuel, look at her. She's perfect, like her mother," he managed, his voice choked with emotion. He touched the baby's hand, and tiny fingers gripped his with surprising strength. What shall we call her? Margaret had thought about this through the long months of pregnancy. "Rose Dawn Crowhorse," she said softly. "Rose for hope growing in difficult ground. Dawn for new beginnings. And for my mother," Samuel added. "Her Apache name meant Dawn Star. It's perfect." Maria finished tending to Margaret and the afterbirth, then quietly withdrew to give the new family privacy. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm, as if nature itself recognized the significance of this new life. "She's so small," Samuel marveled, now holding his daughter with infinite care. "Were we right to bring a child into this world, with all its hatred and violence?" "We were right," Margaret said firmly, "because we'll raise her to be a bridge, like her father, to see people's hearts, not just their skin, to choose love over fear." The baby nursed for the first time, and Margaret felt a contentment deeper than any she'd known. This child, born of their unlikely love, would face challenges, but she would also know such love, such strength drawn from both her heritages. When James was brought home the next morning, he approached the bed shyly. "Is that my sister?" "Yes." Samuel lifted him up to see better. "Rose Dawn, you're her big brother now. That means you help protect her, teach her things." James studied the baby seriously. "I'll teach her to track rabbits, and which berries are safe, and how to be quiet when the bad men come." Margaret's heart broke a little at this reminder of what James had endured. "And we'll teach her to read and write, to sing songs, to believe that there are more good people than bad in the world." As the days passed, they settled into new rhythms. Rose was an easy baby, alert and content. James appointed himself her guardian, often found sitting by her cradle, telling her stories in a mixture of English and the Apache words Samuel was teaching him. The community's reaction was mixed, as expected. Some came with gifts and congratulations. Others whispered about the mixing of blood, about what kind of future a child like Rose could have. Samuel and Margaret faced it all with the quiet dignity that had carried them through every other trial. Dr. Carthage, when he finally made it through the snow, pronounced both mother and child healthy. "She's small but perfect," he said, "like a little fighter already. She'll need to be," Samuel said quietly. Captain Brennan visited when Rose was 2 weeks old, bringing an unexpected gift. A letter from the territorial governor officially commending Samuel for his work in preventing 3 separate conflicts from escalating to bloodshed. "This is just paper," Brennan said, "but it represents something more. Minds changing. Slowly. Your daughter will grow up in a different world than we did. Not perfect, but better." One evening, when Rose was a month old, Margaret found Samuel on the porch despite the cold, holding their daughter wrapped in thick blankets. He was singing to her in Apache, the melody haunting and beautiful. "What are you singing?" she asked, joining them. A blessing song, asking the spirits to watch over her, to give her strength for the journey ahead. He looked at Margaret. "I want her to know all of it, the language, the stories, the ceremonies that are still allowed. But I also want her to read Shakespeare and understand law and move freely in your world." "Our world," Margaret corrected. "We're making our own world. Remember? Right here." They sat together, their daughter between them, as stars emerged in the clear winter sky. In the house, James slept peacefully. No nightmares tonight. The horses were secure in the barn Samuel had built. The small ranch was thriving despite the season. "I used to dream of my family," Samuel said softly. "Every night, I saw their faces, heard their voices. The dreams were all I had left of them. And now? Now I still dream of them sometimes. But more often, I dream of this. Of you. Of Rose, of James, of the life we're building. The past isn't gone, but it doesn't own me anymore. He kissed Margaret's temple. You gave me that. You gave me a future. We gave each other that, she corrected. From the moment you said, I need a woman, and you need shelter, we were saving each other. Rose stirred in her blankets, making the small sounds that preceded hunger. Margaret took her to nurse, marveling as always at this everyday miracle. Samuel's arm came around them both, sheltering them from the cold wind. What do you think she'll be? Margaret asked. Our Rose Dawn. Whatever she chooses, Samuel said. But I hope she'll be someone who proves that love is stronger than hate, that different peoples can become one family, that the world can change, one heart at a time. That's a lot to put on such tiny shoulders. She won't carry it alone. She'll have James, maybe other brothers and sisters. If we're blessed, she'll have us, for as long as we're given. He paused. And she'll have the memory of how we came together, the story of a storm that brought two broken people together and helped them heal. Margaret leaned into his warmth, their daughter content at her breast, and thought about their unlikely journey. From that first terrifying moment when she'd awakened to find herself rescued by a man she'd been taught to fear, to this perfect evening with their mixed-race daughter and adopted Apache son. Life had taken turns she never could have imagined. I love our story, she said simply. It's not finished yet. Samuel reminded her. This is just the beginning. Rose and James will write their own chapters. Maybe their children will live in a world where no one questions their right to exist. From your lips to God's ears, Margaret murmured. Inside, James called out in his sleep. Not a nightmare, just the restlessness of childhood. Samuel went to check on him while Margaret finished nursing Rose. When he returned, he was smiling. He was dreaming about teaching Rose to ride. He said she was laughing. Samuel's voice was soft with wonder. He's never dreamed of laughter before. Healing happens, Margaret said. Sometimes so slowly we don't notice until we look back and see how far we've come. They returned inside as a family, Samuel banking the fire for the night while Margaret settled Rose in her cradle. James had kicked off his blankets, and Samuel tucked them back around the boy, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, as they prepared for bed themselves. Margaret caught sight of herself in the small mirror Samuel had given her so long ago. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the frightened creature who'd fled into the desert. This woman was marked by sun and work and childbirth, but her eyes held peace. Do you ever miss it? Samuel asked, seeing her contemplation. The life you might have had if you'd married someone else, lived in town with proper society. Never, Margaret said without hesitation. That life would have killed me slowly, from the inside out. This life, our life, it's hard sometimes, but it's real, it's honest, it's ours. They lay together in their bed, listening to the small sounds of their home, Rose's tiny sighs, James's peaceful breathing, the settling of wood in the fireplace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be those who questioned their family, their choices, their right to happiness, but tonight they were complete. Thank you, Samuel whispered in the darkness. For what? For seeing me as a man when the world saw a savage, for giving me children to raise, a future to build, for choosing the hard path when easier ones existed. Thank you, Margaret whispered back. For saving me in every way a person can be saved, for showing me I was worth loving, for proving that families can be made of choice as much as blood. They held each other as sleep claimed them, two souls who'd found each other across impossible odds and created something beautiful from their broken pieces. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, blanketing their small corner of the world in pristine white, a clean slate for all the tomorrows yet to come. In her cradle, Rose Dawn Crowhorse slept peacefully, already dreaming dreams her parents couldn't imagine, already preparing to write her own chapter in the ongoing story of people choosing love over fear, understanding over prejudice, hope over despair. She would face challenges. Yes, but she would never face them alone. The desert had brought them together. Love had made them a family. And sometimes, in this hard and beautiful world, that was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this story of love and resilience in the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're experiencing this tale. Are you listening while driving through your own desert landscape? Or perhaps cozied up at home on a winter evening? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts below. Your comments and perspectives make these stories come alive in new ways for our entire community. Until our next adventure together, keep choosing love over fear, just like Samuel and Margaret did.